Hello, everyone. I think that we can begin this event. And so with that, I welcome you to our event on green sovereign bonds and the role that they can play in the transition to net zero. My name is Dr. Megan Bowman, and I'm Director at the King's Climate Law and Governance Centre. I'll be chairing today's discussion. So we're really excited to bring you this event. It's co-hosted by the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance and the Centre for Climate Law and Governance at King's College London. And I particularly want to thank, before we begin, the Professor David Aikman, who directs the Qatar Centre, and also Professor Sarah Bracking of the Geography Department for their hard work in getting this event on the road. And we will be meeting both of them shortly. So for setting for this event, I want to take us back to last autumn with the launch of the UK government's first ever Green Gilt, or sovereign green bond. And the government raised £15 billion through that bond issuance, with the proceeds supporting a range of green projects across the UK. Importantly, that sovereign green bond signifies one piece of a larger green finance policy matrix that the UK government has committed to. So the aim of this webinar is to bring together experts on sustainable finance to discuss the ins and outs of green bond instruments, their design, their purpose, their potential, their challenges, and how the market can and should evolve to fulfill Paris Agreement goals and the transition to net zero. So let me introduce our speakers for today. Starting off with Matteo Pisani. Matteo is a senior civil servant at Treasury, the UK's finance and economics ministry. Between 2016 and 2021, Matteo was Deputy Director for the Debt and Reserves Management Team, in which role he led the development and delivery of the UK government's green financing framework. So we're really also pleased that Matteo is a visiting professor here at King's College London. So welcome, Matteo. I know you just gave us a wave, but give us another one. Are you there? Do you want to pop your video? Nice. So we'll be hearing from Matteo in just a tick. All right, Matteo Bigoni is our next person I want to introduce next. Matteo is climate executive with the climate change team at the CDC Group, which is the UK Development Finance Institution, where he focuses on adaptation and resilience. He also has extensive experience with capital markets in both Africa and Asia, and previous experience with the Climate Bonds Initiative as head of certification. Welcome, Matteo. Give us a wave.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Yeah, that's great. Nice. All right, lovely. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Sarah Bracking. Sarah is a professor of climate and society in the Geography Department here at King's College London. She's a political economist who researches a range of issues in international development and financial geography, including climate and development finance and notions of power in market structures. Welcome, Sarah. There she is. Give us a wee wave. Nice. And finally, I'd like to welcome Phil Smith. So Phil is Director of Liability-Driven Investment Strategies at BlackRock. He's responsible for researching and developing innovative, sustainable investment approaches, as well as engagement with key pension stakeholders and industry bodies. Where are you, Phil? There you are. Give us a wee wave.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely. So the way we're going to run this event is to begin with Matteo from Treasury to talk us through the Green Gilt story and the broader UK green finance policy ambition. Then we'll turn to a panel discussion with Matteo, Sarah and Phil, and then we'll have audience Q&A with all of you and all of our speakers. So please, in the audience, put your questions in the chat box as we go along. And then David Aikman and I will ask those questions on your behalf in the latter part of today's session. So let us begin this event with Matteo. Welcome, Matteo, to our virtual podium. Take it away, Matteo.
Thank you so much, Megan. Just wanted to check that I've shared my slides. I hope they're on screen.
Yes, you have. They look great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Megan, and thank you very much indeed to you and to David for the invitation to come and speak at this event. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to do so. Just to recap a bit on myself, I'm Matteo Pisani. I'm a senior civil servant at the Treasury, and that's where I led the work to develop the UK government's green financing programme. This led, as Megan just explained, to the issuance of 2 landmark sovereign green bonds here in the UK. And I wanted to, in my opening presentation, just provide some contextual remarks to help frame today's discussion with my fellow panel members, which I'm very much looking forward to, and also to motivate some questions and engagement from all of you in the audience. Just to briefly explain what I will cover, I'll do a little bit first on definitions and a timeline of the approach here in the UK. Then I'll move on to the government's strategic objectives and how the green financing program supports the government's climate and environmental agenda. And then I'll dive into a little bit more detail describing the green financing framework, including aspects of its governance, the expenditures, the approach to assurance and reporting. So let me first start with definitions, which I think it's a helpful thing to do because, I'm sure we got a very mixed audience today, and not all of you might have come across these terms before, to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I've put there the definition of a green bond from the World Bank, which, as you can see, it's a fixed income instrument designed to support climate-related or environmental projects. Then one step on from that, obviously a sovereign green bond, it's a green bond issued by a national government. And it's worth explaining, because I'm sure we got a very international audience today as well, that in the UK, we often use the term gilt. This is a shortening of gilt-edged securities, or the expression that we use to talk about UK government bonds. So when we talk about a gilt, all we mean is a UK government bond. And in the same way, a green gilt is therefore a sovereign green bond issued by the UK national government. What are the differences between a green bond and normal bonds? Well, the standard for this is set by Aikman, the International Capital Markets Association, and is known as the Green Bond Principles. You need to have a use of proceeds framework. That means that you need to allocate the money that you raise through selling the bonds to eligible green projects, make sure it's earmarked for that. You also need to track the proceeds to make sure that the funds that are raised are spent on appropriate green expenditures, and you need to have a range of reporting requirements to provide transparency for investors. Let me next move on to the timeline of how we developed this program here in the UK, most of which happened through the course of last calendar year. And it all started with a speech by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, MP, about financial services in November 2020. And in that speech, he set out his intention to issue a sovereign green bond, the Green Gilt. And then in the fiscal event that followed, a year ago from now, the budget in March 2021, we announced 3 things. We announced that we would issue a minimum of £15 billion worth of green gilts during the financial year 21-22, the year that is about to finish, that we're in now. The Treasury also announced that we would issue not 1 green gilt, but 2 during the course of the year, and that we will also issue a retail equivalent savings product. I'll say more about that later. Then in June last year, we published the framework document, which is the document that sets out all the processes needed to issue the green gilt and the green savings product. Over the summer, we undertook a roadshow with investors to engage with them about our approach. And then, as Megan explained earlier, we issued the first green gilt, a 12-year bond, in September. This raised £10 billion. It was the largest inaugural sovereign green bond transaction to date, and it was also the biggest order book for a UK government bond ever. 1 month later, in October, we issued the second Green Gilt. This was a 32-year bond, which raised 6 billion. And we also launched around the same time the retail product, the Green Savings Bond, through our retail financial services arm, NSNI, or National Savings and Investments. And in fact, it's quite appropriate that we're doing this event today, because at the spring statement at lunchtime today, the Chancellor announced our financing program for the financial year that is about to begin in April 22-23, as part of which he announced that a further £10 billion will be raised through the green financing program, a minimum of £10 billion. So that's the timeline of how we've got onto today. And hopefully that also covers the definitions. And I know that I've covered a lot of interesting elements of the program there, and I will come back to all of them to give you a bit more detail. But first, I thought it would be worth talking about some of the strategic context for the government here, and some of the policies that the government's green financing program will be supporting. And I'd like to talk first of all about the UK government's climate change objectives, and this is really a story about the UK's path to net zero emissions. Since 1990, the UK has reduced its emissions by 48%, while at the same time, the size of the economy has almost doubled. The UK is now working on a commitment to reduce emissions by at least 78% by 2035, compared to 1990 levels, which is the most ambitious intermediate target of any major economy to date, and that is on the path to get to net zero, so net zero relative to 1990 by 2050. There's a whole range of policies in place to help meet these targets, and the one to pause on is the recent net zero strategy, which was published in October last year. The net zero strategy outlined measures to transition to a green and sustainable economic future, and in the process helping businesses and consumers move to clean power and more energy efficiency, while also supporting the creation of many highly skilled jobs, leveraging up to £90 billion of private investment by the end of this decade. That big picture strategy for the rest of this decade is supported by a specific sectoral plans and strategies, for example, on clean energy, investment in hydrogen technology and use, energy efficiency in buildings, etc. And many of these policies are the ones that will be financed via the government's green financing framework and the issuance of green gilts and their retail equivalent product. Next, I wanted to say something about green finance, and many of you will be aware, I'm sure, but let me remind you that the UK hosted COP26 in November in Glasgow. COP26 was an opportunity for the world to come together and commit to take action to limit rising temperatures. It was the biggest summit that the UK has ever hosted. It brought together 120 world leaders, over 40,000 key figures from governments, civil society, business and youth, to tackle the urgent challenge of climate change. The key UK government objective was to build on the 2015 Paris Agreement to keep global warming to well below 2%. And the Glasgow Climate Pact, combined with increased ambition and action from countries, means that the target of 1.5 degrees remains in sight, but only if we see concerted and immediate global efforts. Crucially, for green finance, the COP had, for the first time, a specific day dedicated to finance. As part of that, the UK government committed to become the world's first net zero aligned financial system. That basically means moving towards a system of mandatory disclosures on transition planning for all financial sector firms, as well as a sector-wide transition pathway. We also announced that we would introduce new economy-wide sustainability disclosure requirements, which is a similar thing. It's about getting businesses across the economy to report consistent information on how they impact climate and the environment. And that will go hand in hand with a new UK green taxonomy, which is being developed at the moment, which will set out robust standards for which investments and activities count as green. Beyond the UK, 41 advanced and developing countries, which represent together over 70% of global GDP, backed the creation of a global climate reporting standard by the IFRS Foundation. They're the people that set accounting and reporting standards to give investors information they need to fund net zero. All of which is consistent and supported by the government being transparent itself about the environmental and climate impact of its own securities that we issue and our activities. And that brings us on to the UK government's green financing framework. I'd like to now give you a bit more detail about this. The framework document is probably the single most important document that you can look at if you're interested in understanding how the UK government does its green financing. I've included the link there in this slide, and that's a picture of the front page. It has been developed in accordance with the latest version of the green bond principles that I mentioned earlier by Aikman, International Capital Markets Association. And we also intend to align, once it's ready, with the UK green taxonomy, which is being progressed this year. The framework has been designed to fit in with other government initiatives, such as the net zero strategy that I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan on climate. But obviously the overlap is not completely perfect, they're complementary rather than substitutes, because some activities that contribute towards net zero may not be funded through the green financing program, for example. It is worth noting, I know today we're talking about sovereign green bonds and net zero, but the focus for our green financing approach is not only climate change and net zero, but also the government's environmental and biodiversity objectives. And this builds on the landmark independent review published last year on the economics of biodiversity by Professor Partha Dasgupta. The framework sets out how the proceeds from the sale of the gilts and the savings product will finance expenditures across 6 categories, which I've set out in that slide. They are clean transportation. Example there will be infrastructure for electric vehicles, say. Renewable energy, such as offshore wind infrastructure. Energy efficiency, for example, schemes to decarbonize public sector buildings. Living and natural resources, which is the category within which we hope to be able to fund the expenditures that will help us meet our environmental objectives, such as Nature for Climate Fund, but many others. Climate change adaptation, for example, the flood defense program, and pollution prevention and controls, such as infrastructure to capture carbon. There's a number of exclusions set out in the framework. We can pick these up in the discussion in the Q&A. They're the standard exclusions that most issuers have on vehicle infrastructure for vehicles powered exclusively through fossil fuels, large hydroelectric energy infrastructure, so on and nuclear, so on and so forth. Now, one of the key innovations is that here in the UK, we introduced a retail product alongside the sovereign green bond, the Green Gilt. Let me just say a bit about this so that the audience members can understand it. We basically have 2 types of government financing in the UK, wholesale and retail. The balance between the 2 varies year to year, but is roughly 90% wholesale, 10% retail. There are 2 agencies of Treasury that help us deliver the financing approach. On the wholesale side is the Debt Management Office, who issue the gilts on behalf of Treasury. And on the retail side is NSNI, National Savings and Investments, who issue the savings products. Maybe for this audience, NSNI will be a bit less well known, but NSNI has been around in various forms for over 100 years. They have over 20 million customers, and they're probably best known for their most popular product, which is the premium bond. And this was a world first, one of the key innovations, that we decided within the same framework, we'd introduce a retail savings product linked to the sovereign green bond framework that we use on the wholesale side. So the funds raised by DMO and NSNI will flow to the Treasury into the Exchequer, and there will be earmarked and allocated to eligible green expenditures using the green financing framework. Just in case you're interested, the NS&I product is a 3-year savings product. People can save between £100 and £100,000. It has a fixed interest rate, currently 1.3%, and it goes on to fund all the same expenditures in the 6 categories that I mentioned earlier. And it's actually, I think, on sale now. There's a link there in case people want to go and look at it. Let me next move on to a brief mention of governance arrangements, and this slide highlights the process for governance as well as the process for evaluation and selection of green expenditures. And the way we've done this is that we've set up a cross-governmental board chaired by us in Treasury, plus our 2 financing agencies, Debt Management Office and NS&I, as well as the main government departments who own the budgets through which many of the green expenditures will be financed. And they are, you might not be able to quite see it there, but the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the Department for Transport, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And we actually started working with them from shortly after the Chancellor made this announcement in November 2020. And we consulted with them extensively in developing the framework. And the idea is that this body will exist and meet a number of times a year so that we can work together to identify and verify the eligibility of the green expenditures for the programme. And in doing that, we can consider not only the environmental credentials of the expenditures, but also whether they bring other social benefits. They will also help us review the allocation of proceeds on an annual basis, and we'll work with them to produce the reporting in terms of allocation and impact. Obviously, over time, if required, other departments will be able to join the board if they have expenditures that could be eligible within the framework. A key thing that I think is important to explain is set out in this slide, which is the time window that determines the use of proceeds. So, to what expenditures can you allocate the proceeds from selling the bonds? And this is not quite a UK innovation, but it is an area where the UK is being as ambitious, I feel, as any other sovereign issuer. And what the slide illustrates is that the expenditure window that we will use will cover 4 years, and will be limited to only 1 year in the past. So expenditures that took place no earlier than 12 months prior to the year of issuance. But then both the current year and 2 years into the future, as shown in the graphic. And we made a commitment that we will allocate at least 50% of all net proceeds in any given year to green expenditures in the current and future years. So to give you an example, in the year that's about to finish, we've raised about £16 billion so far. And this way of thinking about the expenditure window means that at least 8 billion of that, but potentially more, will be allocated to expenditures that have happened this year or happen in this year or are yet to happen in the next 2 years. And that allows us to focus on financing new projects that help address climate and environmental challenges. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the external reviews. Because maybe some audience members won't be that familiar, but assurance is a very important part of developing a green financing framework. And the way that this normally happens is that if you're an issuer, you have to contract with what is known as a second party opinion provider, an SPO provider. Is a key part of the process of issuing a sovereign green bond, and they provide the assurance that the framework and the process is consistent with the green bond principles that I've mentioned a couple of times, and that the proceeds will go towards expenditures that qualify, are eligible. We contracted after following a public competition with VE, which are one of the global leaders when it comes to second party opinion. And they provided us a report. They did this independently, and we've published it. The link is there. This was all made available to investors before we did the roadshow. And this is particularly reassuring to those investor groups, because they need to know that the issuers have put in place the right infrastructure to do what the sovereign green bond needs to do. They provided an extremely positive opinion of the UK government's financing framework. They concluded that we were fully aligned with the 4 core components of the Green Bond Principles. The framework they deemed will support a robust contribution to sustainability. This is a similar assessment to that received by many other major sovereign issuers. And it was also the highest rating that we were able to achieve while the UK green taxonomy was still being developed. As an issuer, they deemed ESG performance to be advanced. ESG is environmental, social, and governance credentials, which is the highest possible rating. And they thought that our framework was coherent in terms of its compatibility with the government's strategic sustainability priorities. So on the whole, we were very pleased with this level of assurance from the SPO. But we decided that rather than getting just one external review, we would get 2, and this is another key UK innovation compared to other sovereign issuers. And this slide shows the second report that we got, another external review. It was conducted by the Carbon Trust. And this was a bit different. This is what you call a pre-issuance impact report. And we think it's the first of its kind among sovereign issuers, and we hope it sets a new benchmark for others, and crucially helps bring a greater level of transparency for investors. What the Carbon Trust did, and the report is also available through the link, and it was made available before we did the engagement with investors. They assessed the alignment of the government's intended allocation of proceeds, which was done, in the first half of last year, based on estimated plans at the time. They assessed how compatible is that with the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations on climate targets for the whole of the UK. So they were basically saying, okay, these things that you say you're going to fund through your Green Gilt program, your green financing program, what sort of impact are they going to have on the environment, and are they going to help you meet your climate change goals? Now, their conclusion was, and I quote, that they were confident that the program will contribute to achieving net zero by 2050. And they further thought that it introduced a level of coherence with the government's environmental agenda as well. Now, this was particularly helpful as an innovation when you combine it with a forward-looking expenditure window. Because, with backward-looking expenditures only, if we had done that, you can imagine investors are able to go and look at the programs and their impacts. But this is a good way, when you've got so much of your expenditures yet to happen, to reassure investors about what some of the impacts might be ex ante. And we also thought it was particularly helpful in the context of our retail savings product, because a lot of the investors in the green gilts in the wholesale product are very sophisticated, and we'll hear from Philip and others in a minute. They've got very good teams set up to assess all of this. But when you're talking about members of the public who just want to put some of their savings towards contributing towards the government's climate change objectives, we thought a product like this, which gives you a view on the impacts beforehand, was a helpful thing to have. Next, I want to talk about our approach to reporting, this has two aspects. We've committed to publishing 2 reports. So starting with the allocation report, we've said that this will be published no later than 1 year following the issuance of the products. So that means that the first version of this report will be published before September this year. And then we'll publish on an annual basis after that. It will cover both the proceeds from the sale of the green gilts, but also the green savings, the retail green savings bond. And it will list, a share of allocation of proceeds that's being used for expenditures, which categories they fall within, any unallocated proceeds that need to be carried forward, and also any material developments related to any of the green expenditure categories. This is that allocation report is a standard part of the approach, as I mentioned earlier, due to the obligations created by the sovereign green bond principles for all issuers. We'll also be publishing an impact report, and that will we'll do that within 2 years of the initial issuance, so 2 years from last September, and it'll come at least every 2 years, but maybe more frequently. And that will set out some of the environmental impacts from the expenditures that have been funded through the program. And this is here's another third innovation from the UK. We also committed to report on the social co-benefits from our green investments. So this will be things like jobs created by the expenditure, the impact on small and medium enterprises, the regional distribution of the impacts. We're still working out the precise range of metrics. But this is a really interesting development, we think, and one which I think has gone down really well with not only investors, but also think tanks on the third sector. Because, most investors, and again, we'll hear more from my colleagues in the panel in a minute, don't operate following an environmental only set of criteria. They also worry about the social implications of some of the assets that they choose to invest in. So we're very pleased to have been able to be the first sovereign issuer to commit to report that. Now, so let me just maybe sum up on my last slide. In less than 12 months, the UK government, we developed and deliver not one sovereign green bond or green gilt, but two, plus a retail green savings product. The first green gilt in September, 12-year bond, raised £10 billion and was the largest inaugural sovereign green bond. The second green gilt in October was a 32-year bond that raised £6 billion, and it's still the longest dated sovereign green bond in issue. We also launched the first ever retail green savings bond via NSNI, the first bespoke retail savings product linked to a sovereign's green financing program, to give retail investors an opportunity to participate in the collective effort to tackle climate change. And we introduced other innovations as well: the forward-looking slant, the impact assessment, and the social co-benefit reporting. All of this supports the government's climate and environmental agendas, not only obviously through the finance raised, but beyond that, it provides a strategic signal of the government's direction on this policy. It sets a standard in the approach to sovereign green bonds, and crucially also private sector issued green bonds, we hope, that others can follow. And it ensures much better transparency, ensuring that those investors who care about ESG considerations are able to meet the issuers. So, creating demand and supply for assets and liabilities that are exclusively in support of green objectives. Let me stop there and hand back over to you, Megan, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mario. An incredibly thorough presentation that has set out some of the key themes that we want to go further with in our panel discussions. So let's turn to the panel discussion now to tease out some of those themes and questions arising from Mario's presentation about the sovereign green bond issuance, specifically the UK green finance strategy more generally, and of course the urgency of doing all of this in the context of addressing the climate crisis. So audience members, please do put your questions for the speakers in the chat box as we go along, because we'll do an audience Q&A after we've gotten all of our panel members together to discuss these issues. All right, so I'm going to kick off the discussion. Let's check that you can still see me and hear me. Is that all correct? Yep.
Yep.
Thanks, Mario. All right, good. So the first thing I want to kick off is I really want to focus on the drivers for uptake. So we heard from Mario about the supply, what we call the supply side of this sovereign green bond, this gilt issuance. But let's focus on the drivers for the uptake of it. I mean, there's no point issuing something if no one's going to buy it. So what are the drivers for uptake of it by the investors or the buyers, what we call the demand side of the equation? So Phil, I want to turn to you first. And I want to ask, why would clients or portfolio managers buy sovereign green bonds, particularly, I guess, if we focus in on the UK defined benefit pension industry, and in light of their fiduciary duties, So kick us off, Phil.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so just to kind of recap on the business I operate in at BlackRock, liability-driven investment and what that is. So we work with predominantly pension schemes and defined benefit pension schemes, as Megan mentioned, so where they've made commitments to pay members many years into the future. What we do for them is help them match the proceeds from their assets to those liabilities. And what those liabilities look like is a load of cash flows going out into the future, sometimes inflation linked. And one of the best ways of matching those liabilities is by buying bonds, which similarly give you that series of certain cash flows. So when we get the issuance of green bonds, that is particularly of interest for pension schemes who are looking to potentially enhance the characteristics of their pension scheme from an ESG perspective, as Mario mentioned earlier. And green bonds is one of the ways of doing that. So why would a pension scheme, why would any investor, I suppose, buy a green bond rather than just a regular bond? I think there's a few different drivers at play here. The first one is around valuations and values. So this may actually be a way of seeking to generate excess returns, what is often referred to as alpha. And there's a limited supply of green bonds at the moment. The market's growing rapidly, but the actual supply versus non-green bonds is still quite low. And that supply will continue to grow over time, but it's likely demand is going to keep outstripping supply for some time to come. And that may mean that actually you see the price of green bonds continue to increase relative to non-green bonds, the yield on green bonds being lower than on non-green bonds. And this often gets referred to as a greenium. So a premium, green premium, greenium. And there are certainly some investors that buy green bonds, both from sovereigns like the UK government and from corporates, because they think in the sort of short to medium term, the value of this asset will increase. And if they hold those to maturity and they've bought that bond with a lower yield than the non-green equivalent, they will lose money. But if they buy them and they go up in value in the short term and then they sell them again, that is a way of actually generating value. So that is one potential rationale why some people might be buying green bonds at the moment, is to take advantage of that. I think the other two arguments are a little bit more sort of long term in their thinking and maybe in line with the reason for the existence of green bonds. And those are sort of more outcome driven arguments and more impact driven arguments for buying green bonds. So as a way of introducing the kind of regulatory requirements on UK DB pension schemes as it relates to the environment and ESG, the pensions regulator, which regulates all UK pension schemes, has introduced additional guidance and requirements for trustees to consider ESG factors as part of the review of all parts of their portfolio. So there are certainly some pension schemes out there that are looking to buy green bonds because it helps them to show that actually we've taken account of ESG considerations in the operation of our liability-driven investment program, for example. So that's a more sort of outcome-driven argument. However, if there is a greenium, if they receive a lower yield than they would have done buying another bond, they're effectively paying a price for ticking that regulatory box. And that is something that we have seen some pension schemes struggle with from a fiduciary perspective to their members. So what does fiduciary sort of mean here in this context? It means they have to try and achieve the best financial outcome for their members. They have to put that first and foremost. And some views are out there in the world from lawyers that actually looking in that lower yield for a bond that fundamentally has ultimately the same kind of credit quality as other bonds from that issuer doesn't necessarily make sense. And then the final argument around impact is actually that you think by funding these specific projects that will be backed by the green bond, where the proceeds will be spent, you are having some longer term positive impact, perhaps changing the marginal utility of a green project versus a non-green project, for example, if it becomes cheaper for the government to issue green bonds than to issue non-green bonds. The reality is there isn't really concrete proof of this being the case at the moment. So it isn't clear that countries that issue more green bonds and spend more on green projects than they would have done otherwise, just because they find their cost of financing for green bonds lower. But this is certainly an argument that I think some investors use, and that they're almost prepared to give up that yield premium for the impact of the investment and the money being spent in that way. I'll pause there, Megan, in case you want to take any other questions or move on to other areas.
Yeah, bless you, Phil. Let's so that's giving us lots of good stuff. All right, good. And we're beginning to get some questions in the chat bots, which is really exciting. So I think what we might do actually is I want to start involving, let's get some new perspectives in, and then we can just throw questions at it at the end. So I guess, Matteo, let's bring you into the discussion at this point. If we expand the focus, so Phil gave us a really good perspective of the corporate sort of world. If we expand this out beyond UK shores, how might this issuance, motivate a global market rather than just sort of an offshore UK market? I guess from your perspective of CDC as an investor, what do you see as the role of sovereign green bonds in developing country emerging markets like Africa and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, thank you, Megan. As you mentioned, CDC is the UK's development finance institution. And at the end of last year, actually released our new 5-year strategy where we commit a minimum of 30% of our new commitments into climate finance. And so the role of climate and investment at CDC has become very important. And essentially, with the new strategy, we've also expanded the geographies where we can operate. And typically, CDC would operate in sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa in general, Southeast Asia, and with the new strategy, the Caribbean. And so you could see that our geographies are very much aligned with what we call impact investments. So when we look at climate, as Mario mentioned, we look at, at the climate impact itself, but also with a development angle. So we want to see also social impacts as well as climate impacts. And this is because obviously we look at our investment through the lens of a just transition. So we believe that obviously the most vulnerable communities on our planet are going to be the most susceptible to climate change. And so for us, the end result is to, first of all, quantify the impact, but also to provide measures and new assets that can sort of alleviate the impacts of climate change. And so for us, we look at sovereign green bond as a way to actually, first of all, align the issuer's strategy, in this case, the sovereign issuance, with the country's nationally determined contributions. And as you can imagine, for developing economies, adaptation and resilience plays an important part, both in quantifying the impacts, but also in terms of new project and assets to finance through the issuance of the sovereign green bond. And so typically adaptation and resilience measures such as development of water assets, or Mario mentioned the sort of biodiversity sort of aspect slash nature-based solutions that are very impactful, but at the same time are not normally found in commercial bonds, in corporate bonds. And so sovereign bonds can actually include those specific projects and assets that are somewhat kind of rare in the general green bond market, especially adaptation resilience, pure adaptation resilience bonds are typically quite rare. Adaptation resilience tends to be somewhat a portion of the bond, not the entirety of the bond. And so things like flood defense systems, water assets, biodiversity, but also, for instance, subsidies that can allow developing economies to sort of have a system of subsidies for the retrofitting of buildings. Those can all be considered adaptation and resilience measures. And so for us, for an impact investor, sovereign bonds can sort of determine the way of travel, the direction of travel, by aligning the strategy to nationally determined contributions, but also to basically finance or refinance adaptation and resilience project and assets. And that is quite important. The role of finance institutions, development finance institutions, is quite key in this, because they have this double sort of role of investor, but also as provider of technical assistance that can sort of guide national governments, but also general green bond issuers into the labelling process. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Yeah, okay, fantastic. I think that's such an important point. The sovereign green bonds linked to the NDCs. We haven't even nationally determined contributions as part of the Paris Agreement, and we really haven't discussed the Paris Agreement at all at this moment until now. So I think it's a really important point to see how this fits in to the global need to align markets and mobilise this finance at scale. So thank you, Matteo. I now want to bring in Sarah, because let's have some critical reflection on the potential and promise of these sovereign green bonds, and particularly the green bonds are often lauded as the good news story of green finance, the thing that can really shift the needle. And when we look at these statistics, I guess we actually see perhaps a different story, that the green bond market actually makes up a very small percent of broader bond markets and the broader financial market scaffolding generally. So I guess the question is, well, can these sovereign green bonds actually bridge that gap? And maybe Matteo touched on part of it with linking them to the NDCs, but I guess the question, Sarah, I really want to direct to you is, is the optimism about their potential misplaced? And particularly your research previously has highlighted some critical reflections about the green finance market. And I guess I'd love to know what you see as the potential wins, but also the potential pitfalls here.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I have got a couple of slides. I know the other commentators haven't used them. Would that be okay?
Of course, please, yes.
I had a few food metaphors. The problem here for me is that whether this can do things at scale. So the problem, if you wanted a nutritious meal, is that you have the salad for a starter, but if you then have the pie and chips main, it's not going to do very much good for you. So I think there's a slight inconsistency here, that we're greening some government bonds while leaving others as brown, the pie and chips. So for me, the failure for there to be a convincing UK government policy on stranded assets, grandfathering oil and gas, off-ramping fossil fuel subsidies, new exploration licenses, still allows high carbon emissions activities to counteract the good work done by these green bonds. So I should stress here that what I agree with Mario, that there are some absolute front-running things about the design of these green gilts that is world leading, and it does put London as the key green financial centre. Our 6 carbon budget, although the carbon accounting is generous, does just pull us down. We had a flurry of government policy around COP, the Green Industrial Revolution, National Infrastructure, Das Gupta Review. We're mandating climate-related disclosures and net zero accounting. All of that is brilliant, but we still have a lot of brown investments. And until we mainstream our climate change risk analysis to the rest of government spending, this does risk being the add-on. So, for example, although this is large, total gilt sales by the government in 21-22 reached 252 billion. So these two green gilts put together was still only 6.3% of total government debt raised by gilts. And furthermore, the bad news for the UK, probably in international financing, sustainable financing, is that sterling denominated bonds still account for less than 2% of the global market. My second issue, so it's not as big as it seems. It's big if you look at it in an absolute sense, but relatively to other government expenditure in the global market, we could still do more. And that's reinforced by the fact that the order book was 12 times oversubscribed. So there is excess demand out there, and the spread narrowed very quickly. There's the second issue that I think is potentially problematic, is that we are looking for eligible expenditures that have already happened. And there is the potential for leakage into things that aren't in the designated list of eligible activities. So the Treasury is maintaining the right to spend this money. The Treasury intends to allocate the proceeds of all green financing to the eligible green expenditures. But if it doesn't do that, it can manage the unallocated proceeds in line with normal cash management guidelines. So it's not entirely ring-fenced. It is possible that it could be used for other forms of government debt, however they've been derived, and that questions the quality of the additionality. I think there's also potentially an issue that if the departments are bidding for this, how do we know that if they get the Green Gilt money, that their counterpart funding in generic lines isn't just reduced? Are they competing with each other? Potentially, there could have been an open window where we have a step change looking at new types of expenditures rather than just initially matching them to the ones we already have. The impact framework, I thought was good, accepting that some of the socioeconomic indicators are a bit underdeveloped. So there is one that says number of flood defences, whereas that's not unambiguous in its normative direction. In North Norfolk, where I come from, one big flood defence might be better than 3 small ones. So I think there's work to be done on the some of the impact indicators. I was also troubled by the fact that we're going to develop a new UK taxonomy when the EU has just finished in July 2021 their own sustainable finance taxonomy. Given that we want to grow the green market, I think we're missing a trick in having another lot of paperwork that investors will have to meet when the European one is already there. And in fact, the European one has to standardize with US standards. So to grow the market, we don't really need another taxonomy as it's adding to costs. And then we have the counterfactual, what we could have done better. I would like to see the government mainstreaming its climate concern, as I've just said. And potentially the counterfactual also ends in a meta question. We don't want to give the impression through a green bond that we can solve this problem just with finance. I know that's beyond the scope of this, and I'm just about to be quiet. Climate change is a social problem primarily, and some of the things that have been costed are going to shift taxpayers' money to pay back the gilt into potentially subsidies for private industry. So the distribution of costs and benefits of the just transition still needs to be monitored in a slightly larger frame of reference than the current impact monitoring. I'll shut up there for a minute. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. No, don't ever be quiet. These are really important questions, really, really important points, and really well made. So thank you. And in fact, there's just a couple of things that I want to pick up right now before we allow Mario a chance to respond and go to audience Q&A. And Phil, you're still with us? I want to bring you back. These notions of greeniums and market size, things that you touched on, that Sarah just touched on. Look, why would you say, something David Aikman and I were talking about, why would you say that this market is still so small? I mean, the fact that we have a greenium, which is, I understand, like it's cheaper to issue a green bond than a conventional one, I guess you would say, means that the demand from investors for these assets is very high. So, what's happening here? Can you talk us through? are we not creating sufficient investment projects? Do we need more pipeline? Is it a taxonomy issue? How do you see it?
I think in the UK, it's a question of the newness of the program, frankly, and getting that off the ground. And what we've often seen be the case in other countries is that after the sovereign issues green bonds, you see a massive increase in the amount of corporate green bond issuance in those countries. So as much as the UK has made some innovations in its program, it was actually relatively late to the party versus some other parts of Europe. So we had French green bonds, for example, for several years now, and those programs have grown more significantly. And if you look at EU issuance, so some of the issuance that's kind of come about as a result of the pandemic and more sort of centralized EU issuance that's now taking place, the proportion of those bonds that are green and social has really significantly increased. But I do think that there is still some challenge at times around the taxonomy and the administration of taxonomy to ensure that projects are identified and that the quality of the green bonds is maintained. And that is important and is something that matters to investors. So, if the government suddenly said, a very high proportion of our issuance is going to be green bonds, and they didn't really have sufficient projects to do that and started squeezing other things into it, then investors under their own taxonomies or under the green bond principles would start rating those bonds less highly. And we have a very clear and strong taxonomy at BlackRock around what constitutes a green bond, and we rate things between light and dark green. And we do see some cases coming through of very light or even what we call off-scale green bonds, where the projects that have been shoehorned in just don't really fit with the green bond principles. So I think there is an element of the taxonomies that are there, and there may be some technologies that might be required to enable the transition. So it was a really good example of this when the first bonds were issued, blue hydrogen. So that's hydrogen that's formed from burning gas. And under the green bond principles, that doesn't really qualify as something that you can put into a green bond proceed because it involves using a fossil fuel. Whereas green hydrogen does qualify and could have been used. But there's a journey to go from using blue hydrogen to potentially using green hydrogen that there may be good reason to do, but it perhaps holds back the amount of green bond issuance you can see in the near term. And I think that's a live debate that happens amongst the groups that sort of set taxonomies, that set green bond principles, thinking on an ongoing basis around what the right mix is, but while maintaining that robustness that you don't get greenwashing. And that's very important. So one of the things that we do always see when green bonds are issued by sovereigns is it's a fantastic chance for engagement, an opportunity to speak to them about their net zero plans, what sort of technologies they're looking to use.
Thank you very much, Phil. Yeah, I think that the intangible factors such as engagement don't often get discussed, but they're just as important in many ways, the raising awareness. While we're on the topic of the taxonomy, and I kind of want to open this to Matteo and Sarah as well, before we swing back to Mario. What makes a green bond green, and Phil picked up on some of these issues. So the role of the UK taxonomy that's in development, how it might dovetail with the EU taxonomy, and debates about inclusions and exclusions, especially, they have become really front and center in light of the war in Ukraine. So Mario, I mean, you can jump in here too, but I want to also welcome the floor to Matteo and Sarah. Sarah's given us our concerns, but Sarah, if you have any preferences that you wish to state, and Matteo as well, this may influence the work that you do, then please jump in.
I just thought it was rather odd that on the one hand, it's aligned with the Green Bond principles, which are a generic, more international one, but probably more lenient than our very own homegrown London CBI principles, because the green bond principles talk about process, and as long as investors are talking about a narrative for their use of process, they've sort of met them. Whereas we had an alternative, stricter set of principles, which was the CBI standards, which we didn't use. But then, sort of counterintuitively, when it came to the taxonomy of eligible projects, we want to develop our own. And I thought that was an odd choice because it's delayed the process somewhat, even though we're already late to the party. And I thought if we were aligned to the EU, Brexit aside, that would have allowed the market to grow quicker.
Thank you, Sarah. Matteo, did you have anything to jump in with?
So CDC uses the taxonomy used by other multinational development banks, such as the IFC, the Asian Development Bank, EBRD, etc. And it's a taxonomy basically aligned with strict market standards, which is very much aligned with the Climate Bonds Initiative's criteria. So really represents a set of green definitions that go beyond the general categories of the green bond principles, and really want to define granularity in a granular way what green is by analyzing the intrinsic characteristics of the project and assets. It's sort of like a binary choice, yes and no, sometimes, with very specific thresholds. So in a way reflects how the EU taxonomy is structured, and how the Climate Bonds Initiative's criteria are structured. But also because obviously we want to provide standardization in the way we work. So the last thing that we want to do is confuse investors. And so that alignment with the methodology, which is then in turn aligned with international standards, we think that it provides consistency and coherence to the bonds. And so when a CDC decides to invest in a transaction, it will look at what the underlying project and assets are and how they align with the methodology. And so obviously for us, the use of the methodology is a way to upfront avoid greenwashing, because the last thing that we want to do is find ourselves with, as an investor, with assets that we thought were green but then end up being emissive assets. And so for us, it's a question of having visibility around, clear visibility around the green characteristics of the project and assets, and B, have a granular understanding of the eligible project and assets. And clearly that's for both, and I think that this is aligned with what Phil was saying, having an internal taxonomy that can determine whether, as an investor, the investment itself is acceptable or not, and the related impact indicators that the investment will produce.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Mario, let's turn to you. I can see you poised, ready to add your viewpoint on the taxonomy issue, but also on anything that I think has been raised by the panel thus far. And because we have a few audience questions as well, which we want to get into, and you will be front and center in answering those questions, Mario. So you have a little bit of work ahead of you. So if you want to, just on what has happened so far, if you want to give your reflections, your responses, we welcome those before we go to audience Q&A.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and you know, in a nutshell, I agree with everything that's been raised. I mean, one point I would make is that, you know, I think no one is claiming that, you know, issuing a sovereign green bond is the beginning and the end of solving our problems and our challenges when it comes to climate change. You know, they're not a sufficient condition, as we tend to say, but, you know, I think arguably they play a necessary role in helping support greater transparency and information flows between investors and borrowers. So, you know, I think it's worth bearing that in mind. And on this particular issue about the taxonomies, I think, you know, it's not it's not really reasonable to expect that the whole rest of the world will adopt a taxonomy developed by just one jurisdiction, simply because they did it before other jurisdictions, because different, area, different governments will have different priorities. So there's reasonable to expect that, the US might have a slightly different approach to their green taxonomy than, say, the EU. I don't think that's particularly surprising. I think what is important, however, is interoperability. So making sure that we don't do more damage than good in creating additional complexity. And, for example, when it comes to the development of the UK taxonomy, the 6 high-level principles, objectives are the same as in the EU taxonomy. I think where some of the difference might eventually come out, and it's being worked on at the moment by many experts and independent advisors to the government, is in some of the detail regarding thresholds. And I know, Sarah, you mentioned the climate bonds initiative. I mean, which is a great initiative, and we do a lot of work with them, and we've engaged with them frequently. But green taxonomies not only are they about more than bonds, they're about other activities that might happen in the economy and society. And crucially for us, at least, our green taxonomy is not only about climate, it's also about environmental goals. Hence why there's some good reasons to deviate from that. Also, if I take a step back, ultimately what we're dealing with here is a externality or a market failure, and I think the government has an important role to play in trying to solve that, or contribute towards solving it, by setting a standard that helps the flow of information. Let me stop there, and let's maybe Megan move to the Q&A.
Fantastic, let's do that. Now, I've been assured by the King's Business School tech team, Marion, thank you so much for setting this up, that we can all, speakers, put our videos on. Sounds very 1980s, doesn't it? Put our videos on and but just remain muted so that we can see you all for the Q&A. So we have questions in the chat box. Why don't we kick off with Matthias's question, Matthias Nilsson. Now we can all see the questions. I believe all of us can see the same questions. But it's a nice, I think it's a really nice question actually, whether Treasury primarily finances green projects through green gilts and bonds, or whether it does so directly through taxes and emissions and other forms, of course. So, Mario, I think you're the best person to answer that.
That's a great question from Matthias, so thank you. I mean, the truth is, the general approach is that none of the revenue flows, whether they come from external financing through borrowing or generated through the tax system, are hypothecated or earmarked to anything. So, we've got a general rule in the legislation that everything goes into the central pot and everything comes out. That's generally not a problem. It's an interesting aspect of public financial management that we could discuss another time. But the problem with it is that, if you give money to the government either through your tax revenues or by buying one of the conventional securities, you have no idea what's going to happen to the money. There's no way of tracking it. And that is what the green bond principles and the green gilts, the green financing program, solves, because, we can give guarantees that the proceeds from the sales of these instruments will be earmarked for specific activities. And that's the way we fix that. Now, obviously, that is not to say that some activities that contribute towards meeting net zero won't be funded in other ways, because clearly the amount of activity that the government is undertaking that contributes towards meeting our climate objectives could at times, as it is now, be greater than the amount that we can raise through a green bond program, as Philip was explaining in one of his answers.
Fantastic, thank you. Phil, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think just one thing that was interesting from some of the announcements today around the sort of spring statement and the DMO's issuance plans is that the amount of green gilts planned for this coming fiscal year, so 2022-2023, is maybe a bit lower than people expected. So maybe market kind of consensus, we might get a similar amount again to what we had last year, 15 billion, and we've now had it announced that be a minimum of 10, but perhaps a slightly lower number than is expected. And that's a higher percentage of the total amount of gilts that are now planned to be issued this year than was issued last year. But equally, because the proceeds from those bonds has to go to a particular project, and if enough projects sort of existed that other revenues are sort of then going to be subsidizing them as that amount of green bond issuance drops, it does create an interesting question of why is that figure fallen? And I don't think anyone on this call is going to be able to answer that. It's a question we'll be putting to the DMO, because there's clearly very high demand. Actually, as a taxpayer, you can issue these bonds at lower prices than other bonds. It may have made sense, even if they become quite a big proportion of the net amount to be issued, if tax receipts have gone up or whatever else, to keep that issuance higher. So that is an interesting sort of observation around Matthias's question that I think is worth just flagging.
Thank you. Matteo, your name just got mentioned. Is there anything you want to jump in with, or are you happy to another question?
I mean, it's an interesting sort of discussion. I can give CDC's perspective on this. And so again, going back to the level of detail that we require in terms of earmarking, ring fencing, we definitely have a preference for ring fencing. And in fact, I think that for green bonds specifically, we require ring fencing. And it's in a way, it's quite difficult to have ring fencing in sovereign bonds, because as Mario explained, that's how things are. Sovereign bonds, you earmark things rather than ring fencing them. So that puts us in, I wouldn't say in a challenging position when working with governments. Some of the green bonds, sovereign green bonds that were issued in the past, such as the Nigerian sovereign bond, were actually earmarked. So ring fenced. So it's not impossible. It's just that most of the time the government has to really pass a law specifically for the ring fencing. And so that requires an extra step. But for us, that gives us extra comfort as an investor, specifically in countries where perhaps there's political instability, or there's less sort of confidence in the ability of the government to manage the proceeds internally. So one thing to bear in mind as an impact investor, I guess, is this question of ring fencing versus earmarking.
Perfect. Sarah, did you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, Megan, I did want to just make a sort of a related point that some of the schemes that are earmarked, the Green Gilts has already been earmarked for some schemes, so I've just put in the question and answer if people are interested. But they include some potentially very expensive things that we need to fund around sustainable farming, around climate change adaptation, flood defences, sea defences, which in the past were mainstreamed in government budgets. So I do worry that the Green Gilt has been sold as if it's going to do a lot of mitigation, but crowded in there is a potentially huge expenditure around those things which don't have intrinsically a business model. They don't return profits. So I would be interested to know what the government's going to do if it doesn't have enough money in this Green Gilt. Are those programs going to be funded from generic expenditure?
And is that a rhetorical question, or is that something you'd like to pose to Mario in this channel?
I'm happy to sort of explain how that sort of works. And one of the really intriguing things about greeniums and why you should even pay a premium is that the proceeds are ring fenced, but the way in which the government pays back the coupons and the principals on green bonds are not at all. They are completely general. So this is not a revenue bond. The bond isn't issued linked to some project that will pay back the revenue. The proceeds are spent on a project, but the actual revenues come from the entire government revenue base. So there's no difference in credit profile of chance of default of the green bond versus any other bond issued by the government. And therein lies the big question about why anyone would pay a premium for this bond, because you've got no more sort of risk or lower risk than if you were buying any other government bond. And really it is purely either a non-economic effect, people are willing because of the way they feel to pay a higher price for the bond because of how its proceeds are used. There may be some of that, and you see that in an NSNI. That's a great example, right? 1.3% interest rate I think you could probably achieve an interest rate closer to 2% on a 3-year bond with other providers, but people are putting their money into that NS&I program because they are comfortable giving up that 0.7% of return because they know where the proceeds are going. Now, you could be right or wrongly, but they are doing that. So there's that kind of heart argument, and then there's also the supply and demand effect. The fact that there is just a lot of money chasing these bonds, both from UK investors and international investors, and there is still quite a limited supply. So there's no good reason that greenium should exist, and the bonds would default in line with the rest of the UK government, in terms of not being able to pay back the money. There's no difference in credit profile. So it's a very interesting dynamic when we look at green bonds in general as to why they have these different prices.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Phil. On that note, I think why don't we pick up, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm going to go with Aiko Sivet. I hope I have that right. Aiko's question, and also a question from Tim Foreman. I'll run them both together. Let's start off with Mario. Has the UK considered alternative green bond structures such as the twin bond issuance framework introduced by the German and Danish governments? Question 1. Question 2, has the large interest in the Green Gilt changed the way the Treasury is thinking about issuing more? Does it have a goal for issuance in the future for both the near term and the longer term? So Mario, they're both square for you.
Thank you, Megan. Let me start with Tim's question, which is, and also picking up on your comment, Philip. I mean, obviously we are constrained by the amount of eligible green expenditure in the window, and we further constrained because unlike other issuers, for example, Germany, who do all backward looking, for some of the future years, the plans are not fully specified. So, we need to be careful that we don't allocate to things that, might not happen, might have some risk around them. And that's a trade-off between additionality and being able to provide ex-ante transparency on impacts and allocations. Now, one way to answer your question, Tim, is to look at what the Committee for Climate Change has said is needed in the UK economy to meet net zero by 2050. And they've said £50 billion a year for the next 30 years. So, do the math. That's a lot of pounds. Now, not all of that is going to come from the public sector. In fact, actually, the challenge of net zero is as much with the private sector as it is with the public sector. But, that tells you, and this is a legally binding commitment that the government has to meet this target, that, let's not get lost in the weeds. Okay, we've had 1 year of doing this. We're going to be doing this for 30 years. There'll be new technologies that we don't even know yet that the government might be able to support. The government might be able to, co-fund the infrastructure for these technologies that will generate a very big need to raise finance. And, a lot of that, if it's eligible, depending on how the taxonomy develop, how the economies develop, could be that we issue a lot more. That will be my expectation. But obviously, we only issue plans 1 year to the next because it's all subject to market conditions and demand, etc. And on your question, Aiko, we did look at all other issuers. I mean, one of the advantages of being a bit late to the party, and then obviously we leapfrog to be the second largest sovereign issuer in the world, is that we were able to look at what other people did. And, I think there's lots of interesting examples. The German twin structure, we looked at that. We looked at what France are doing. Sweden, I think, have a very interesting approach as well, focusing on deeper green expenditures. But in the end, we thought that the German approach didn't quite work for the UK, partly because, unlike Germany, the UK still has a very, very elevated financing need as a result of not only the last shock, but the one before that as well.
Excellent, thank you. I've got my eye on the time, so I'm going to move on to the next question posted by Tim on behalf of Reese Bidder. I'm going to take the second half of that question, Reese. I feel like the first half we've probably covered from a few different angles, but the second, are there protections to ensure green spending in other parts of government aren't reduced, offsetting the effects of the green spending hyperlocated to the green bonds, as I assume the green investments don't yet pay for themselves? Again, Mario, I'm going to direct that one to you. I think you're probably a good person to pick that up. Have you had a chance to digest it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and others do chip in because Matteo, Philip, Sarah, you would have looked at other sovereign issuers that don't have the legal targets than we have. I mean, it's worth explaining that one very good example of this is, for example, spending on nuclear energy, which it doesn't qualify under our framework, so we can't finance that through the sale of green bonds. But most people would think of it as a crucial way, and in fact the government's position is this is an important part of meeting our net zero targets. So there are some Venn diagrams here. They overlap a little bit, but they don't completely overlap, as we've discussed a couple of times. Now, the thing that's going to keep us from not reneging on other areas of green spend that are outside the green financing framework is actually the government's legal commitments to meet the interim targets for emissions reductions and the 2050 target. That's the way that I would think about that.
Thank you very much, Mario. I'm going to ask the final question to the whole panel, and in your responses, you can make this your moment of summing up before we close the event in 4 minutes' time. And that's Johnny Mulligan's question: is the capital now flowing to the private sector, renewables, energy efficiency, agriculture, or how, in practical terms, is the capital being dispersed? How do companies in the real economy tap into this capital? Another wonderful question. Mario, you've been on the hot seat, but you kind of knew that when you accepted the invite. If you want to go first, Dibbs, or you can go last, and we can actually start off with Phil. So, would you like a moment to compose yourself while we go to some other panelists? Yeah. Okay. Great. So, Phil, why don't we kick off with you, then Matteo, then Sarah, and then Mario to complete before we wrap up. 3 minutes to go.
Yeah, sure. So to answer Johnny's question, I mean, I don't see this, as I don't work in government, in terms of the proceeds from the green bonds that have been issued in the UK. But as was set out, some of it's backward looking, but a lot is forward looking. So that the proceeds from that will be starting to flow into the projects that have been earmarked over the next couple of years, and we will be very keenly awaiting the information that will be released later in the year to sort of show where that's been spent and assess that and make sure that is as expected. So it will flow through, I'm sure, to some extent through contracts to private sector. It will flow through to research and other sort of government funded efforts that will hopefully aid the transition towards net zero. But there's also, I mean, I suppose what we shouldn't lose sight of, a very big role here for the private market. And there's a lot of money flowing very directly into things like renewables and into areas like infrastructure directly through things like pension funds and insurance companies working with asset managers to invest in those projects. So there are reasons they might need to buy gilts in their portfolio. There's also lots of reasons they might want to buy other asset classes where they take on a lot more of the risk of that infrastructure, and making sure that is aligned with the Paris Agreement, with net zero is also absolutely key. So it needs to be a multi-pronged approach. It can't all be driven by government.
Music to Mario's ears, Phil. Good. Sarah, let's please give us your two.
Yeah, my understanding, but I'm an outsider here, is that there are a number of open windows for various programs in which projects are being actively considered. People are bidding for the money, and that process is in train. From my experience of development finance, and here Matteo knows more, I think potentially there might be a slight windfall waste challenge here, in that certain renewables are market competitive, so they don't need to be de-risked or subsidized by government. So that will have to be monitored over time. But overall, this Green Gilt can subsidize innovative technologies. It can provide that demonstration effect. It can encourage the private sector to go invest at scale once the government has proven a de-risking effect. And in that sense, it works like development finance has done, as augmenting private capital, crowding it in, creating pooled funds. If that all happens, and as Mario said, we're right at the beginning of that pathway, it will be great. I wouldn't want to see us subsidizing renewables when they're already, the energy regime's already shifted. They should be able to cope on their own. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really good, encouraging note to finish on. Matteo, a quick comment from you.
Yeah, just taking back the discussion, so linking back the question to also the issuance of sovereign green bonds in developing economies. I think that one of the most important elements of sovereign green bonds is that it shows the way, as I mentioned, and has an effect on capital markets, specifically where capital markets are shallow. So it shows the way in terms of what project and assets to finance, but also puts a spot on green capital markets and can have sort of like a multiplier effect in terms of potential issues that never thought about issuing a green bond actually doing it, but also setting up the capital market infrastructure within the country. So, for instance, the first thing that happens after or soon after or right before the sovereign green bond is issued is that the stock exchange will issue a guidance for green bond issues. So things like that probably would have not happened without the issuance of the bond. And obviously, through the financing of green project and assets, money trickles down into the corporate level sort of issuance. That's my 2 cents.
Bless you. Thank you, Matteo. And Mario, let's finish with you in response to that question, or just a sort of a summary sentiment before we close the event.
Thank you, Megan. For what it's worth, I agree with everything Philip, Sarah, and Matteo have just said, completely on the money. I mean, ultimately, you know, the government will purchase goods and services from the private sector, or will use the proceeds to provide incentives or subsidies to activities that the private sector can take that will help meet net zero as an objective. That's a narrow answer. Obviously, you know, it's very early days for us. This is not only a multi-year program, a multi-decade program, and you know, we in the UK are very keen to keep learning. I think today has been part of that. And I will encourage everyone to keep on engaging with the government on this because, you know, it's a constantly shifting market and area. And I think the standards and the practice, you know, it won't be in 5 or 10 years, it won't be the same as it is today. And I think there's loads more that we could do.
Thank you so much, Mario. And I think that's absolutely true. And that we all have a role to play in this. So thank you so much. So I want to thank all of our speakers for an incredibly engaging discussion, really timely, really important, and to keep our eye on that, not just net zero, but Paris Agreement implementation prize, because we have a climate crisis on our doorstep. So thank you so much. David Aikman, would you like to wrap up today's session? Thank you so much for co-organising this, by the way, David, and also Sarah. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I mean, let me just say a big thank you to all our speakers. I feel we've had a rich, informative discussion. I certainly feel I understand a lot more about the ins and outs of this market and some of the kind of details that really matter. I think this is, you know, I think Mario really summarised it nicely. This is a nascent market. There's an element of learning by doing here. We can kind of watch how this evolves in the years ahead. But let me thank everybody. It's a great discussion.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'll bring this event to a close. Go well.
Bye.